So I'm going to begin this message by sharing a few doctor jokes. So here we go. A young man on acid walked into a dentist office and said, "Can you help me? I think I'm a moth." The dentist said, "You don't need a dentist. You need a psychiatrist." "Yes, I know," the man said. The dentist asked, "So why did you come here?" The man replied, "The light was on." Ha! A wild-eyed man dressed in a Napoleonic costume and hiding his right hand inside his coat entered the psychiatrist's office and nervously exclaimed, "Doctor, I need your help right away." "I can see that," retorted the doctor. "Lie down on that couch and tell me your problem." "I don't have any problem," the man snapped. "In fact, as Emperor of France, I have everything I could possibly want. Money, women, power, everything. But I'm afraid my wife Josephine is in deep mental trouble." "I see," said the psychiatrist, humoring his distraught patient. "And what seems to be her main problem?" "For some strange reason," answered the unhappy man, "she thinks she's Mrs. Schwartz." Ha! Last one, here we go. Late one night in the insane asylum, an inmate shouted, "I am Napoleon!" Another one said, "How do you know?" The first inmate said, "God told me." A voice from another room shouted, "I did not!" Ha! Okay. So, after Jesus left the Samaritan village in the last sermon, where he had met the woman at the well, he proceeded to Galilee. What's interesting to me about this decision is that Jesus was only there a very short time before he returned to Jerusalem for the next feast. It's as if he had a specific purpose for returning to Galilee. So let's see. And as we look at these next two events, I want you to be especially thinking about this. Who do you identify with most in each event? Because these aren't just written to be a history of the life of Jesus. So who are you in these events? Who do you see yourself as? So we're looking at John chapter 4, the end of 4, verses 43 through 54, and then chapter 5, verses 1 through 15. At the end of the 2 days, Jesus went to Galilee. He himself had said that a prophet was not honored in his hometown. Yet the Galileans welcomed him, for they had been in Jerusalem at the Passover celebration and had seen everything he did there. As he traveled through Galilee, he came to Cana, where he turned the water into wine. There was a government official in nearby Capernaum whose son was very sick. When he heard that Jesus had come from Judea to Galilee, he went and begged Jesus to come to Capernaum to heal his son, who was about to die. Jesus asked, "Will you never believe in me unless you see miraculous signs and wonders?" The official pleaded, "Lord, please come now before my little boy dies." Then Jesus told him, "Go back home, your son will live." And the man believed what Jesus said and started home. While the man was on his way, some of his servants met him with the news that his son was alive and well. He asked them when the boy had begun to get better, and they replied, "Yesterday afternoon at 1 o'clock, his fever suddenly disappeared." Then the father realized that that was the very time Jesus had told him, "Your son will live." And he and his entire household believed in Jesus. This was the second miraculous sign Jesus did in Galilee after coming from Judea. Afterward, Jesus returned to Jerusalem for one of the Jewish holy days. Inside the city, near the sheep gate, was the pool of Bethesda, with 5 covered porches. Crowds of sick people, blind, lame, or paralyzed, lay on the porches. One of the men lying there had been sick for 38 years. When Jesus saw him and knew he had been ill for a long time, he asked him, "Would you like to get well?" "I can't, sir," the sick man said, "for I have no one to put me into the pool when the water bubbles. Someone always gets there ahead of me." Jesus told him, "Stand up, pick up your mat, and walk." Immediately the man was healed. He rolled up his sleeping mat and began walking. But this miracle happened on the Sabbath, so the Jewish leaders objected. They said to the man who was cured, "You can't work on the Sabbath. The law doesn't allow you to carry that sleeping mat." But he replied, "The man who healed me told me, 'Pick up your mat and walk.'" "Who said such a thing as that?" they demanded. The man didn't know, for Jesus had disappeared into the crowd. But afterward, Jesus found him in the temple and told him, "Now you are well, so stop sinning, or something even worse may happen to you." Then the man went and told the Jewish leaders that it was Jesus who had healed him. So first, let's look at the royal request. So when did this happen? It's at the end of week 14 of Jesus' ministry. And where it happened, as it states in the passage, Jesus is in Cana, which is where he changed the water into wine. You can see that on this map. This man came from Capernaum, which is about 20 miles away. So who was this man? Well, various translations translate the Greek word as nobleman, which is King James, government official in the New Living Translation, or royal official in the NIV. That last one is probably most accurate. According to the language used, this man wasn't just an official, but connected to the royal family of Herod Antipas in some way. Capernaum was a prominent city in the region, so there were many reasons why he might be living there. Most likely, he worked in Tiberias, which was nearby, and his family was in Capernaum. So what was his request? Heal my little boy. The Bible says he begged. So get this picture. A man connected to royalty who was in a completely different social stratum than Jesus comes to him. He's tried everything money can buy to heal his son, and now he's desperate. He doesn't care about his status. He doesn't care about the crowds. He doesn't care how this looks. He falls at Jesus' feet and begs him to heal his baby boy. So how did Jesus respond? Well, based on Jesus' response, it seems like the people of Galilee welcomed him because they wanted to see miracles like he had done in Jerusalem, not because they believed he was Messiah. This royal official, however, had a different motive. The man begged Jesus to come to Capernaum to heal his son, but Jesus told him to return home because his son had been healed already. Jesus didn't condemn him for being rich. He didn't rebuff him for making Jesus the last resort. Jesus had compassion on him and healed his son. So how did the man respond? Well, he went home. And I think this is the most amazing thing about this event. The man didn't question, he just believed. In fact, he believed so much that he took his time getting home. On foot, the man could have made that trip home in 8 to 10 hours. It's likely that he wasn't on foot, so he could have moved much faster. However, instead of rushing home, it seems like he spent the night in Cana because he's met by his servants the next day on the road and is told about his son's healing. So what can we take from this? Well, Jesus proved his power to heal even without being near the sick person. Jesus' power is not confined to one space. As an aside, John mentions this as Jesus' second miracle in Galilee. The book of John was written for a Greek audience, and in John, everything is in sevens. 7 miracles, 7 discourses, etc. In addition, John chose to highlight miracles that flew in the face of the Greek gods. Jesus changed water into wine, destroying Bacchus. In this miracle and the next, Jesus heals, destroying Asclepius. And Jesus doesn't condemn. Jesus had compassion and healed the man's son. No questions asked and with no expectation of return. He didn't even say, I'll heal your son, but you need to follow me. He just healed him. And the third thing is faith requires action. Now you might want to ask the question, what would have happened if he had tried to insist that Jesus come because he didn't believe? Well, I don't know, but the truth is you don't separate the two. You can't separate the two. Jesus healed because of the man's faith, and the man's faith was proven by his reaction. And now we get into the second event about the sick sinner. So when did this happen? Well, this happened during week 15, May 31st, 27 AD. It was on the Sabbath day before the Feast of Shavuot. Shavuot is one of the feasts of the Lord celebrated 50 days after Passover. One of the things they would do on this day is remember the giving of the Torah to Israel and the covenant God made with his people there. So when did this happen? Well, this was at the Pool of Bethesda in Jerusalem. You can see that on this map. In some translations, there's a verse 4 that talks about an angel stirring the water. This verse is not in the earliest and best manuscripts that we have and represents a piece of Jewish mythology that probably came to them from the Greeks. The pool would bubble periodically because of some natural phenomenon in the pool. However, during the time that the Greeks controlled Jerusalem, they probably associated this bubbling with the stirring of the waters that Asclepius would do with his staff. This became adopted by the Jews and sanitized to be an angel stirring the waters. This is a lot similar to superstitious traditions that a lot of Christians believe. So who was this man? In contrast to the royal father in the previous miracle, this man was at the opposite end of the spectrum. He had been sick for 38 years. The Bible doesn't explain what his sickness is, but we can be pretty sure he wasn't lame, blind, or leprous because there are other miracles naming these specifically that Jesus heals. The word for sick here carries with it the idea of being weak, having a lack of strength, and not being whole. It's used to translate a verse from Isaiah 53:4, which is in Matthew 8:17. This fulfilled the word of the Lord through the prophet Isaiah, who said he took our sicknesses and removed our diseases. The word in bold is the same word. It speaks of spiritual sickness as well as physical sickness. Now, I don't know what illness this man had, because it doesn't say, but here's what we do know. He was so sick he could hardly move. His sickness had caused him to be completely alone, rejected by family, friends, the religious community, even the other sick people around him. And his sickness was caused by his sin. More on this in a second. It is likely that his sickness was sexual in nature. So what is his request? Well, he made no request. He had so completely lost any hope of getting well that he was just waiting to die. So how did Jesus respond? Well, Jesus didn't respond here. Jesus initiated. When I read the Bible, I like to ask questions. In this case, I want to ask, why didn't Jesus heal everyone there? Why this particular guy? Jesus walked into this place that was crowded with people with superstitious hope that the water would move so they could possibly get healed. Jesus could have chosen any of them. In fact, he could have healed all of them. But he zones in on the worst case, the least of the least. In fact, Jesus probably had been aware of this man already. This man had been in that spot every day of every year for as long as Jesus had been alive on earth. Jesus had a specific purpose for everything he did. He could have healed this man while he was there 50 days before during Passover, but he waited until now. And Jesus asked this guy an odd question. Would you like to get well? Well, duh. It's like being asked if you're okay after banging your head really hard. No, I'm not okay. It's obvious. This is an obvious question. Of course he wants to get well. But that's not really the questions we're asking, are we? And Jesus wasn't asking the obvious question either. What Jesus asks isn't about being healed. The Greek word here is genesthai. It looks familiar because of its transliteration, genesis. Jesus is asking the man, do you want to be made new? Do you want to be reborn? Even more particularly, Jesus is asking, are you willing to do whatever it takes to be generated whole? You see, Jesus didn't just want to heal this man's physical body. He wanted to heal his entire being, spiritually and physically. He wanted to restore him into his relationships with his family, his friends, his religious community, and his God. He wanted to make him clean and give him a chance for the first time in 38 years to celebrate God's covenant with Israel in the temple. So how did the man respond? Well, he correctly answers, I cannot do it on my own. I cannot be whole on my own. I cannot be made right with God on my own. But he is willing. God doesn't care about ability. He cares about motivation in the midst of inability. In your weakness, God says, I am strong. God does not help those who help themselves. God empowers those who recognize their complete inability, but those who are willing to act in faith. Jesus gives him a chance to act in faith. Pick up your mat and walk. So he believes, and he does. Now the Pharisees are shocked and offended by his actions. How dare he work on the Sabbath? They tell him he's breaking the law. But that's not true. The mat that this man was carrying would have been made out of bamboo or palm fronds and probably weighed less than a grapefruit. There's nothing in the Torah about doing such a thing. The issue at stake was that over 300 years, the Pharisees had been writing a religious system that included thousands of extra rules and regulations in addition to the Torah, many of which were totally stripped, many of which did totally strip the purpose of God's loving commands. Jesus frequently came in conflict with these man-made rules because they had nothing to do with the Torah. Jesus strictly obeyed God's commands, but ignored the commands of man where they came in conflict with God's commands. By the way, where did Jesus find this man later? In the temple. His first reaction to being healed is to go to God. Why did Jesus wait until Shavuot, the celebration of the giving of the Torah and the covenant relationship God had with his people? Because he wanted to have a living illustration of the restoration of that relationship and the true difference between the living water he was offering and the dead religion the Pharisees offered. So what can we take from that story? Well, first, Jesus proved himself to be the one who restores us to a state of true covenant relationship with the Father. But also, again, Jesus doesn't condemn. Jesus did tell the man, stop sinning or something even worse may happen. That wasn't a threat, it was just a reality. But here's what's interesting to me. Did the man sin? Yes. Did he deserve judgment? Yes. Did Jesus do that? No. Jesus could have walked up and pointed out that man as an example to his disciples. He could have talked about his lifestyle and the choices he had made that led him to be lying there for 38 years. He could have talked about how breaking God's Torah has consequences and how the man deserved to suffer the consequences of his actions. But he didn't do any of those things, did he? He looked on the man with compassion. He offered him a chance to be made whole, and then he healed him completely. He didn't even wait for a thank you. Only later, when Jesus found the man in the temple, did he challenge the man to obey God's commands from now on. And again, faith requires action. Jesus told the man to take his mat and walk. What if the man had just continued to lie there? There was no miracle until the man put his faith into action. So I asked you at the beginning, where do you see yourself in the story? You could be the Pharisees. Now, no one will admit this, but sometimes this is exactly who we are. We see the mighty works of God and we get upset because it doesn't fit into our idea of what those works might look like. We make up rules about living the Christian life that have nothing to do with actually following Jesus. For instance, many years ago, some church people would have been shocked with the idea of Christians going to movies, playing cards, eating at a restaurant that serves alcohol, or shopping or working on Sunday. Had we gone to church at that time, we would have been condemned for doing those things. Any of you people listening guilty? I think we all are. Do any of those things have to do with following Jesus? No. Now think about today. What things do we bind people to that have nothing to do with following Jesus? One that I think about is clothing coming to church. Well, you have to dress a certain way. But there's a lot of things that we as Christians do that have nothing to do with Jesus, but we put that on people. You can only use this translation of the Bible. You have to dress a certain way. You have to speak a certain way. The second thing is the desperate. Maybe you see yourself as the desperate father. You've come to the end of your rope and you've tried everything you possibly can, and now you have nothing left but to go to Jesus. Now, I often wonder why it is that we wait until the very last second before we turn to Jesus instead of turning to Him first. However, here's the good news. Jesus, the cat just walked in the room. Here's the good news. Jesus loves you and He wants to do a miracle in your life. If you will trust Him completely and follow Him, He will bring healing. Maybe you're the hopeless. Maybe you see yourself as the man at the pool, broken, beaten, alone, and unable. You've reached the end of your rope and you don't know where to turn. And then a shadow falls across you. You look up and see not condemnation, but love. Not judgment, but healing. Not separation, but restoration. Jesus wants to heal you completely. He wants you to have a relationship with Him, which is the first step in complete healing. He is offering you an opportunity to walk away from the emptiness of where you are and follow Him to new life. If you'll do that, it'll change everything. So who are you in the story? If I were to ask that question to most people, they would immediately identify with the father or the man at the pool. However, and here's what God really struck me with as I wrote this. If I am a follower of Christ, then in these events, I am Jesus. Because Jesus tells us that we are His body. Jesus tells us that just as He was sent, so He sends us to do His work. He sends us to show not judgment, but compassion. He sends us to not give condemnation, but healing. He sends us to be Him to the rest of the world. To be His hands and His feet to a lost and dying world, a people living in darkness. So let me encourage you this week to arm yourself up with the weapons that God gives you. Love, compassion, mercy. And then go and radically change the lives of the people around you, just like Jesus did to these two men in this story. Have a great week, and God bless you.